If I asked you right now to explain the difference between risk appetite, risk tolerance, and risk threshold, could you do it? If you hesitated even a little bit, you're not alone. These three concepts tend to trip up PMP and RMP candidates all the time. And honestly, again, it's not your fault. They sound similar. They're all about risk levels. But here's the thing. They operate at completely different levels of your organization. They're going to serve you in different purposes, and PMI is going to test you on knowing these differences. So today, I'm going to break down all three of these concepts, show you how they can cascade from boardroom down to your project. And I'm going to give you a simple memory framework so you never confuse them again. For those who don't know me, I'm Russ Parker, the bearded PM, owner of 44 Risk PM. So let's get into this explanation. First, we got to establish the big picture here. These three concepts exist in a hierarchy that flows from organizational strategy down to project execution. Risk appetite flows into risk tolerance, which flows into risk thresholds, all making up your overall risk capacity. So think of it like this. If you have the strategic intent from your senior leadership and it gets translated through your program and portfolio management teams into specific, measurable boundaries that you can use as a project manager, that's what we're doing. Each level takes a broad guidance and makes it more specific and actionable for you on the ground. So that is the key insight that I want you to think about when it comes to these terms. So let's start at the top. Risk appetite is the degree of uncertainty an organization is willing to accept in anticipation of a reward. And that's almost word for word from PMI standard for risk management. But here's what you need to know. It's set at the organizational level. We're talking about board of directors, senior leadership, and it's expressed in qualitative terms. High, moderate, low, or we're using descriptive about the company's philosophy. It's relatively stable, and it doesn't change project to project. And it answers one fundamental question. How much risk are we willing to take on as an organization to meet our strategic goals? So let me give you an example of some risk appetite here. A venture capital firm, high risk appetite. They know 7 out of the 10 investments they put in might fail. But that's cool because they know the 3 winners out of those 10 are going to make it all worthwhile at the end of the day. But put that up against a nuclear power plant. They have an extremely low risk appetite. The consequences of failure are catastrophic, period. Or how about this one? A pharmaceutical company. Now here we have a mixed appetite maybe. You have a high appetite for research and development because most drug candidates are going to fail. They accept that, but they have zero appetite for any manufacturing contamination of their products. So you have the same organization, but different appetites for different risk categories. Now let's move into the middle layer, risk tolerance. Risk tolerance is the degree, amount, or volume of risk an organization will withstand. It's the acceptable variation around objectives that you can absorb without compromising your strategic goals. So some key characteristics that we see at the tolerance level is that it is set by the program or portfolio level. We're getting more quantifiable than appetite. We're getting into some ranges now when it comes to how much tolerance you can take on. And it defines how much deviation you can sustain. And it may vary by risk category. So the question tolerance really answers at the end of the day is how much deviation from our objective can we absorb before it becomes unacceptable. So some examples for this would be, let's say you have a program. Your tolerance level would be based on if your program can absorb 15% cost overrun before it starts threatening other strategic initiatives. Or let's say you can tolerate up to 3-month delay in your project before you start missing the market window that you're trying to hit. We're saying a statement like our brand can withstand a 2% defect rate before customer satisfaction starts tanking. And this is something critical you need to know for your exams. Different stakeholders can have different tolerances. So your sponsor might have a low tolerance for budget variance, but a high tolerance for schedule, where the functional manager might be the opposite. So you need to understand your individual tolerances that shape how you're going to manage and report risks on your project. And that brings us into our final level that you need to know, especially at the project management level: risk thresholds. Risk thresholds are the specific, measurable levels of risk exposure that trigger a defined response or escalation. These are your actionable decision points. And some characteristics that we see here are they're set at the project level, and they're informed by the appetite and tolerance that was set above you. Many times these are quantitative, they're specific, they are real numbers that you are dealing with, and you need to tie them to trigger actions. And you better have them documented in your risk management plan. So the question we have when it comes to this is, at what point must we act or escalate? So an example for this one would be, if you have an EMV exceeding $50,000, you're going to need sponsors' approval for anything that's going on. Or if your critical path delays past 10 working days, you need to make sure you escalate this to your steering committee for decision making. Or another one might be, you have a contingency reserve, right? If your consumption hits 60%, you need to do a formal risk reassessment to go through your risks to make sure that you can actually sustain 40% left in that contingency reserve. So you can see that these are specific triggers that tell you exactly when you need to act. So let's tie this all together now with one integrated example. Let's say you're a construction company building a hospital. So at the organizational level, they're going to give a risk appetite statement that says, we're a conservative firm that prioritizes safety and quality over aggressive timelines. We won't pursue contracts that compromise our safety standards. So now at the program level, their risk tolerance is going to look like healthcare construction. We can tolerate up to 10% cost overrun and up to a 6-month delay, but zero tolerance for safety incidents resulting in lost time injuries. So this helps you at the project level develop your risk thresholds. So you can start making statements like, any risk with the EMV over $100,000, you need to escalate this up to the program manager. Or if you have any near-miss safety incidences, this triggers an immediate stand down and review across the board. So hopefully you can see now how this cascades down from a strategic philosophy, becomes tactical ranges, that becomes an operational trigger for anyone down on the execution level. Now, I said I'd give you a little memory piece. We're just going to call it ATT. A for appetite. This equals attitude, your organizational philosophy towards risk, the strategic look. And T for tolerance. This is a tolerance for variation. How much can we absorb? And then T for thresholds. This is your triggers, specific action points that you need to take at that level. So ATT, attitude, tolerance, triggers. Now for an application of how this can actually show up on your exam for the PMP or RMP. On the PMP, these concepts are tested at the working knowledge level. You need to recognize that organizational appetite influences project decisions. Stakeholder tolerances vary and must be identified during stakeholder analysis, and the thresholds are documented in your risk management plan. If you're taking the RMP, you're going to go much deeper. You need to differentiate clearly between all three. You need to understand how appetite and tolerance are inputs to your risk management plan, but they're going to dictate your thresholds. And your thresholds need to be in qualitative and quantitative analysis. You need to understand that stakeholder tolerances are going to affect your risk response selection based off these terms. So risk appetite is your organizational attitude. How much risk you're willing to take for a reward. Risk tolerance is the acceptable variation. How much deviation can we absorb and stay within there? Stay tolerant. And risk thresholds are your triggers. At what point must you act? This all makes up your organization's risk capacity. And we remember it with ATT, attitude, tolerance, triggers. Hopefully you found this helpful. If so, hit the like button, subscribe, and hit that bell so you get future updates on the content that I push out every week on project management, risk management, and leadership. So if you're serious about getting deeper into project risk management, make sure you check out my RMP exam prep courses or my PMI-RMP exam prep lab, my community preparing people for the RMP exam. Links for both can be found in the description. And don't forget to watch this video right here where I break down residual and secondary risks. I'm Russ Parker, the Bearded PM, out.